The wind came down from the mountains sharp as a blade, rattling the loose boards of the general store and carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The village sat tucked between the ridges, half forgotten by the wider world, a place where life moved to the rhythm of church bells, mule carts, and gossip whispered across back porches. Folks here carried their pride like a badge, even though most had more debt than dollars and more calluses than comforts. It was the late 1800s, and though the railroad had passed only 20 miles to the east, it may as well have been 100. In this town, old customs held fast, and pity was often treated as weakness. That morning the widow had appeared on Main Street, clutching the hand of her little one. Her shawl was threadbare, her eyes sunken with the strain of hunger, and her voice trembled as she asked for bread. She had once been the wife of a blacksmith, but since illness carried him to his grave, she had been left with nothing but an empty hearth and a hungry child. In towns like this, charity was seldom offered freely. Pride made men hard, and hunger made them harder. What followed was something no passerby could easily forget. The baker, stout and red-faced, waved her away at first, then cursed under his breath when she persisted. "Ain't no handouts here," he snapped loud enough for others to hear. His words brought a hush over the street as people stopped what they were doing. The widow begged again, her voice softer now, pleading not for herself but for her child. The crowd thickened. Some looked away uneasy, but others narrowed their eyes. In this town, a woman asking too much was seen as a threat to order, as though her empty stomach could unravel the rules that kept everyone in line. By noon, the whispers had grown into a roar. A few men dragged her to the edge of the square, muttering that lessons had to be taught, that begging could not become habit. Folks stood shoulder to shoulder, not cheering, not stopping it either, just watching. Her little one cried, clinging to her skirts, but the sound was drowned beneath the scrape of boots on dirt and the harsh commands of men who believed themselves righteous. And then came the mountain man. He wasn't from the village, not truly. He lived farther up, where the pine woods swallowed the sun and the trails twisted like a snake through the rocks. He came down to trade pelts now and again, a tall figure with a weathered coat and a gaze that could silence a room. Most knew little about him, except that he was a man who had faced winters that would kill another soul and lived to tell of it. He was walking into town with a bundle of furs slung across his back when he saw the crowd gather, saw the widow forced to her knees in the dust. For a moment, he stood still. No one expected him to care. Strangers rarely interfered in matters the town called its own, but he didn't keep walking. He stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel, eyes fixed not on the crowd but on the woman and her child. Something in his manner unsettled those who noticed. The men who had taken charge shifted uneasily, though none dared drop their grip. The mountain man did not raise his voice, nor did he curse. He simply asked what crime the widow had committed that made decent folks turn against her. Silence answered him at first, broken only by the child's sobs and the widow's shallow breaths. Then came the murmur's words about order, about fairness, about not letting weakness spread. The mountain man listened, but the look in his eyes suggested he had weighed their reasons and found them hollow. He laid his bundle of furs on the ground, brushed the dust from his coat, and moved closer still. Some men told him to step back, that it was none of his affair. But he did not stop. He bent down, lifted the widow gently to her feet, and placed a steadying hand on the child's shoulder. The crowd bristled, torn between outrage and uncertainty. No one knew what he would do next. The air seemed to tighten, as if the whole village held its breath. The widow's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. The men who had started this shifted their weight, glancing at one another, suddenly unsure whether to press on or retreat. Behind them, the townsfolk waited for someone to act, unwilling to step forward, afraid to be the first to break the spell of that moment. The mountain man looked around the circle of faces, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he reached into his coat and drew something from inside. The crowd leaned closer, whispers running like wildfire through the square. Was it a weapon? Was it gold? Was it food? No one could tell. All they knew was that whatever he held seemed to weigh heavier than iron in that moment, heavier than law, heavier than every unspoken rule the town had clung to for years. The widow's child pressed closer against him, eyes wide with hope and fear. The mountain man met the gaze of the baker, then the others who had joined in, his silence more damning than any accusation. The air thickened, a storm brewing though the sky above was clear dot, and just as the tension reached its breaking point, he took a single step forward, opened his hand, and revealed what he had carried. What he did next shocked the town so deeply that not one person present could pretend life would return to what it had been before. But in that instant, before the act was complete, before the town could fully see and reckon with what was about to unfold, a sound rang out, a gasp from the widow, a shout from the crowd, a creak of wagon wheels as someone hurried to leave. The moment hung there, sharp as a blade, waiting to cut. The village would not forget what happened next. But that part of the story comes after, when the mountain man chose to defy the order of things and force every soul in that town to face what they had become. The gasp that echoed through the square seemed to stretch the air thin, as though the very walls of the town were listening. Children who had been peeking from behind their mothers' skirts shrank back, while the men who had been so eager to show their authority suddenly found their hands uncertain. What the mountain man revealed wasn't a pistol nor gold nor anything that carried weight in the usual sense. It was something far simpler, but in that simplicity was a rebuke stronger than any gunshot. He held out a small loaf of bread, dark crusted and rough, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of pine smoke. He had baked it himself, up in his cabin, far from town, where he relied on nothing but his own hands and the mercy of the woods. He set it into the widow's palms as though it were the most sacred offering, then looked straight at the crowd, as if daring them to say the act was wrong. For a long moment no one breathed. The widow stared at the loaf, trembling, torn between gratitude and fear. The child's hands hovered near it but did not touch, waiting for permission. The men who had dragged her forward glanced at one another, their pride suddenly small beside the quiet force of what had just been done. The mountain man had given freely what they had refused, and in doing so, he had exposed the heart of the town's cruelty, yet no one spoke. The square, once noisy with whispers and shouts, was hushed. In that silence, the history of the place seemed to rise up, pressing down on every shoulder. For years this village had lived by the belief that only the strong deserved to endure, that weakness must be hidden or punished lest it spread. It was a creed born of scarcity, of winters where crops failed, of barns lost to fire, of hunger that gnawed through pride and left behind only bitterness. Generosity was a memory, kindness a luxury. Survival had become law, and the law was often harsh. The widow had lived under that law all her life. She had grown up in this very valley, daughter of a farmer who tilled rocky soil until his back gave out. She had married young, her husband a blacksmith with shoulders broad enough to command respect, but illness did not care for strength. It struck him down one autumn, leaving her alone with debts and a child too young to work. She had tried to keep to herself, sewing and cleaning for neighbors, but as the work dwindled, so did her options. Pride had kept her from begging until her child's ribs showed beneath his shirt. Now, when she finally asked for help, she had, and met not with mercy, but with punishment. The mountain man was different. Folks had always regarded him as an outsider. He lived in a cabin near the timberline, where the winds blew fierce and the nights could freeze a man in his sleep. Some said he had fled the wars back east, Others whispered he was hiding from something worse. But whatever his past, he survived where few could, trading furs for flour and salt, taking only what he needed. He had no family here, no ties that bound him to the town's unwritten rules. Perhaps that was why he had stepped in, because he owed nothing to the customs that chained the rest. Still, his action unsettled the townsfolk more than any weapon could have. By giving that loaf, he had done more than feed a widow's child. He had broken the spell of fear and pride that bound them together. It was as though he had held up a mirror showing them their own hardness, and none liked what they saw. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd, low at first, then sharper. Some muttered that he had no right, that an outsider couldn't tell the town how to live. Others whispered that maybe he was right, though they dared not say it loud. The men who had led the charge grew restless, shifting from foot to foot, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. The widow clutched the bread to her chest, torn between relief and dread. She knew what it meant to be singled out, to be the center of a quarrel in a place where grudges lasted lifetimes. Her child, however, knew nothing of such fears. The boy tore off a piece of the loaf and bit into it, his small face lighting with a joy that pierced the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. For one fleeting second, the crowd seemed human again, reminded of hunger, of children, of the thin line between survival and despair. But the spell didn't hold. The baker, red-faced with shame, stepped forward, his voice rising. He declared that the mountain man had insulted the town, had made honest folks look like villains. His words struck a chord with those who feared change, who clung to the old ways because they had nothing else to trust. Murmurs turned to accusations, suspicion spreading through the square like wildfire. The mountain man said nothing. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, his hand still resting lightly on the widow's shoulder. His silence was a challenge, more cutting than any retort. He seemed to be saying, without words, that no defense was needed for kindness. That truth alone unsettled the town even more. As the sun dipped lower behind the ridge, the air grew colder, and the square seemed to darken with more than just shadow. The townsfolk drifted away in small knots, whispering, glancing back over their shoulders. Some looked at the widow with pity, others with suspicion. Some avoided her altogether, ashamed to meet her eyes. The men who had nearly broken her pride stalked off stiffly, their authority cracked but not destroyed. That night, the village lay uneasy. Candles flickered late in windows as families whispered about what they had seen. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Was the widow wicked, or had they been cruel? Was the mountain man a hero, or a threat to their order? No one agreed, but no one slept easily. The widow, meanwhile, sat in her small cabin on the edge of town, her child curled beside her, his belly full for the first time in days. The loaf was nearly gone, but she held the last crust in her hands as though it were treasure. She wondered what would come of this, whether the kindness shown would shield her or bring more hardship upon her head. Up in the mountains, the man who had given the bread stoked his fire and sat in silence, listening to the wind beat against the walls of his cabin. He knew the town would not let the matter rest. He had stepped across a line they guarded fiercely, and yet he felt no regret. For him, survival had never meant cruelty. The land was harsh enough without men making it worse. In the days that followed, the tension deepened. The widow was watched wherever she went, her steps shadowed by whispers. Some neighbors left scraps of food near her door, too ashamed to give openly, too afraid not to. Others turned away, muttering that pity would ruin them all. Children avoided her child on the street, warned by their parents not to catch the curse of hunger. And the mountain man, he became the subject of endless talk. Some swore he was dangerous, that he would bring trouble down from the hills. Others wondered if he had come to show them a truth they had forgotten. Either way, he was no longer just a figure passing through. He was now a symbol, one the town had to reckon with. Each passing day carried the weight of something looming, a reckoning not yet spoken but certain as the coming winter. The villagers felt it in their bones, in the way the air grew colder, in the way silence stretched longer in the square. They had been shocked once, and they knew more shocks were yet to come, and so the story turned, deepening with every whisper, every sideways glance, every question left unanswered. The widow, the child, the mountain man, and the town itself all were caught in a web of fear, pride, and defiance, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer hold, and the next act would begin. The days after the square incident unfolded, like a slow storm, quiet on the surface yet charged underneath. No one spoke of it openly at first, but the memory of the mountain man handing bread to the widow weighed heavy on every conversation. The blacksmith shop clanged quieter, the tavern muttered softer, and even the church pews seemed stiffer as people sat with the unease of knowing something had shifted. It wasn't just about bread anymore. It was about the rules the town had lived by for years, and whether those rules could be bent without breaking everything else. The widow tried to keep to herself, yet she could not move without eyes following her. When she walked to the well with her bucket, neighbors drew back as though her shadow carried shame. Some of the older women left scraps by her door under the cover of darkness, quick as foxes, leaving before dawn. But in the daylight, they turned their faces away, afraid to be seen offering her kindness. The child, no longer starving but still thin, carried himself differently now. He looked at others not with pleading but with a wary defiance, as if he had learned too early that the world would not always forgive a hungry stomach. The baker grew restless. His pride, already stung by the mountain man's act, festered with every whisper. He insisted that if the town allowed outsiders to shame honest men, then order would crumble. At the tavern, he gathered listeners, slamming his fist against the table and declaring that the mountain man thought himself better than all of them. A few nodded, eager to keep the old ways, but others shifted uneasily. They remembered the boy's face when he tasted bread, and it gnawed at them more than the baker's anger could soothe. Meanwhile, the mountain man kept mostly to his cabin. Though he came into town for supplies more often than before, each time he appeared, conversation stuttered and silence fell. Men pretended not to see him. Women drew their children closer, and yet everyone watched him from the corner of their eyes. He did not speak much, but his presence carried weight. It was as though the mountains themselves had stepped down into the valley and would not leave until something changed. Rumors spread. Some said the widow had bewitched him, that no man would stand against a town for a stranger unless spellbound. Others claimed he was stirring rebellion, hoping to turn folks against one another for his own gain. A few wondered quietly if he was simply right, that maybe the cruelty of the town had gone too far. These whispers crept through kitchens and barns, tugging at loyalties and widening cracks in the foundation of their small society. The preacher tried to settle the unrest, standing in the pulpit with his hands raised high, reminding his flock of Scripture and mercy. But even his words faltered. He spoke of compassion, yet he did not name the widow. He spoke of justice, yet he did not rebuke the baker. His voice carried over bowed heads, but his silence on the heart of the matter rang louder than any sermon. Some nodded in agreement, relieved not to be forced to choose sides. Others left the church with clenched jaws, disappointed that even faith seemed unwilling to speak plain. One evening, as dusk settled and the lamplight flickered in windows, the widow found herself approached by a young farmhand. He had always been quiet, more comfortable with the soil than with people, but now he stood at her door with a basket of potatoes and beans. His hands shook as he offered it, and he muttered that no child should starve in a town where the earth still gave food. She thanked him, her voice trembling with both gratitude and fear, knowing full well that if word spread, he might face the same scorn she bore. He shrugged it off, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his choice. Elsewhere, the mountain man began to notice subtle changes. When he walked through the square, some of the younger men no longer looked away. A few even nodded, quick and nervous, before returning to their business. Others, especially those who gathered at the tavern, glared, openly, their hostility plain. The divide was growing, lines being drawn not by law but by whispers, by who one dared to nod to and who one dared not. Tension bled into everyday life. A quarrel at the mill over a measure of grain turned sharper than usual, ending with threats instead of handshakes. Children repeated things they overheard, sparking arguments among their parents. Even the shopkeeper, once neutral in all disputes, found himself cornered by both sides, asked whether he thought the mountain man was a blessing or a curse. He refused to answer, but his silence satisfied no one. In the background of it all, winter crept closer. The nights grew longer, the winds colder, and the hillsides wore a coat of frost. Everyone knew the season would test them, as it always did, with shortages and hunger pressing harder than arguments. Yet instead of pulling together, the village seemed to be fraying apart. Where there had once been unity against hardship, now there was suspicion and bitterness. One night, as snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals, the widow heard footsteps outside her cabin. She tensed, fearing the baker's anger or worse, but when the knock came, it was gentle. She opened the door to find not one figure but three neighbors she had known since girlhood, women who had not spoken to her since the square. They carried with them jars of preserved fruit and a quilt. They entered quickly, whispering apologies, confessing that they could not stand by while a child went without. Their kindness filled the small room with warmth greater than the fire. Yet, as they left, they warned her that secrecy was survival. The town could not know, or it would tear them apart. Up on the ridge, the mountain man watched from the shadows. He had seen the footsteps in the snow, the flicker of light in the widow's cabin. He did not interfere, but he understood that the town's heart was divided, half still clinging to pride, half struggling toward compassion. He knew too that such division could not last. Something would break, and when it did, it would either free them or destroy them. The baker, sensing his grip loosening, grew bolder in his anger. He began to speak of punishment, of reminding people what happened when rules were ignored. At the tavern, he stirred up men with drink and talk of setting examples. The more he raged, the more his pride demanded satisfaction. He was not content with whispers anymore. He wanted action. And though not everyone agreed, fear kept most from opposing him. Better, they thought, to stay silent and safe than to draw the fire upon themselves, but not all were silent. The young farmhand who had helped the widow began to speak more openly, challenging the baker's words, saying the town could not survive if it turned against its own. His voice was shaky at first, but it grew steadier each time. Others began to listen, torn between fear of the baker and hope that perhaps another way was possible. The tavern became less a place of drink than a battlefield of words, one side shouting of order, the other murmuring of mercy. The mountain man knew the storm was near. Each visit into town felt heavier, the stairs sharper, the air charged like lightning before it strikes. He did not seek trouble, but trouble was circling him nonetheless. The widow knew it too. Each time she held her child, she wondered whether tomorrow would bring kindness or cruelty, whether the bread they had eaten would be remembered as a blessing or condemned as a curse. And so the conflict deepened, rooted not only in hunger but in the soul of the village itself. Pride battled compassion, fear battled hope, and every man, woman, and child carried the weight of choosing which side they would stand on when silence could no longer hold. Winter crept closer. The snow thickened on the roofs and in the shadows. Of the mountains, the story waited to unfold its next chapter, each heartbeat carrying the echo of the question no one dared to answer. What kind of people were they, truly, when the test came? Snow came earlier than most had expected that year, thick and heavy, smothering the roofs and bending the trees along the ridges. By the time November turned its corner, the village was already wrapped in white, the air sharp with frost. Smoke curled steady from chimneys, but the warmth inside homes could not quiet the unease that had taken root. It seemed the storm in the hearts of the people grew alongside the winter itself, and with every passing day, the weight of silence became harder to bear. The widow felt it most of all. Though a few brave neighbors left food in secret, she lived in constant fear that kindness shown to her would bring harm to others. Every creak outside her door startled her. Every voice raised in the square sent a shiver down her spine. Her child, though fed more now than before, carried in his eyes a look too old for his years. He would sit by the small fire, staring at the flames as if waiting for them to fade, asking questions his mother could not answer. Why did the town hate them? Why had the mountain man helped when no one else would? And most of all, would it happen again? The mountain man knew it would. He had seen enough in his life to know that anger never burned quietly forever. It was like dry tinder under snow, waiting, always waiting, until a spark struck and set the whole forest ablaze. Each time he came down from his cabin with his furs, the stares grew sharper, the space around him in the tavern or store wider, as though people feared catching something from his very presence. He had stepped into their world only briefly, but that step had split the town in two, and there was no way back. The baker's fury hardened into something colder, something more dangerous than words alone. His pride had been pierced too deeply, and each day it festered. He saw the way some began to look at the mountain man with quiet respect, the way others whispered about mercy when they thought no one listened. To the baker, this was poison spreading, a challenge not only to him but to the very spine of the town. He began to gather men after dark, trusted friends who shared his bitterness. They spoke low in the tavern, voices covered by the scrape of mugs, planning what they called a reckoning. At the same time, another current ran beneath the surface. The young farmhand who had once brought the widow potatoes grew bolder. His voice, once shy, now carried in the square, though he chose his words with care. He spoke of survival, of the true meaning of community, of how no man thrived when his neighbor starved. Some turned away, unwilling to risk the baker's wrath, but others listened. For the first time in years, there were murmurs of change, not shouted, not demanded, but planted like seeds beneath the snow. The preacher, caught between both tides, grew restless. His sermons wavered, swinging between mercy and order, never committing to either. He prayed louder, but his eyes betrayed the fear of a man who knew that words alone would not hold the town together much longer. His silence on the square incident became its own judgment, and though no one said it to his face, many began to doubt whether he had the courage to lead when courage was most needed. All the while, the child of the widow wandered further from home, drawn to the woods where the peaty snow softened the world and the shadows stretched long. He began to find paths toward the mountain man's cabin, sometimes carrying small sticks of wood as if to repay the bread that had saved him. The mountain man accepted the visits without fuss, sitting the boy by the fire, teaching him to tie knots or carve small figures from pine. These quiet moments forged a bond, one that neither the widow nor the villagers fully understood, but that grew stronger with each day. Word of these visits spread, as all things did in the village. To some, it was proof the mountain man sought to steal the boy's loyalty, to turn him against his own people. To others, it was a sign of kindness that could not be ignored. But either way, it fed the tension, each whisper thickening the rope that pulled the town toward breaking. The first true crack came one evening at the tavern, when the farmhand's words finally collided with the baker's fury. The room was crowded, the air thick with smoke and the smell of wet wool, when the farmhand rose from his chair and said plainly that no one should have to beg for bread in a place that called itself a community. The silence that followed was sharp as glass. The baker rose slowly, his face red, his fists clenched. He called the farmhand a traitor, a weakling, a fool blinded by the lies of an outsider. Chairs scraped, mugs spilled, and for a moment it seemed fists would fly. But they didn't. The mountain man, who had come in quietly with his bundle of pelts, stepped forward. He did not speak, but his presence alone stopped the fight before it began. The baker glared at him, rage twisting his features, but even he hesitated. The tavern held its breath as the mountain man picked up his goods and left without a word. Only when the door shut behind him did voices rise again, harsher than before, each man louder to hide his fear. That night, the baker's group grew bolder in their plotting. They spoke not of order but of punishment, not of pride but of power. The widow, the mountain man, even the farmhand, they were threats now, enemies to be dealt with before the whole town slipped away. Plans were whispered, ugly and certain, and though not all who listened agreed, few had the courage to stop it. Fear bound them tighter than rope. The widow felt it in the air. She saw the looks, sharper now, felt the coldness that lingered even longer in greetings. Her child clung to her more closely, asking if trouble was coming. She told him to be brave, though her own voice shook. At night, she stared at the ceiling, wondering if the knock she dreaded would come before morning. Mountain Man knew it too. His instincts, sharpened by years in the wilderness, told him that the silence in town was not peace but preparation. He sharpened his axe, checked his traps, and kept watch on the trail that wound from the valley to his door. He had faced wolves and storms before, but the look in men's eyes when fear turned to hatred, that was a storm unlike any other. By December, the snow lay deep, muffling footsteps and weighing heavy on the roofs. The village seemed trapped in a waiting game, the tension so thick it could be felt in every corner. Small sparks, an argument over firewood, a child repeating words heard at home, a glance held too long, were enough to set tempers flaring. Everyone knew something was coming, something that would not be turned aside. And then, one bitter night, the bell in the square rang. No one knew who had rung it, but its echo cut through the silence like a blade. Doors opened, lanterns lit, and the people gathered, pulled by fear, by curiosity, by the sense that the moment they had dreaded was finally here. The widow stood at the edge of the crowd, her child's hand in hers, trembling but unwilling to hide. The farmhand appeared too, his jaw set though his eyes flickered with doubt. And from the far side of the square, the mountain man walked in, his coat dusted with snow, his face shadowed but unflinching. The baker was already there, his men around him, their torches casting long, harsh shadows across the frost. His voice carried over the square, heavy with anger, calling for justice, for order, for the punishment of those who had dared defy the town's ways. Every word was a spark, and the crowd was dry timber, ready to catch. Some nodded, some shook their heads, but no one moved. The air was so tight with suspense it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The mountain man stopped in the center of the square, not 10 paces from the baker. He said nothing, his silence more powerful than any speech. The widow's child squeezed her hand tighter, his small face pale in the torchlight. The farmhand shifted, as though ready to step forward but uncertain of his strength. Snowflakes began to fall again, soft against the heat of the torches, melting as they touched the ground. It was a quiet sound, almost lost beneath the roar of the baker's voice, yet it seemed to remind everyone that winter had arrived, that survival itself was fragile. Still, no one stepped back. The standoff had come. The moment all had known was approaching. Pride and compassion stood face to face. The crowd caught between them, the torchlight flickering like the heartbeat of the town itself. And though no one yet knew which way the night would break, every soul present felt the same truth. Nothing would be the same once the next breath was taken. The silence that fell over the square was deeper than any snowdrift, heavy and waiting. The baker's voice had burned itself hoarse, and now he stood trembling with anger, the torchlight flickering across his face. The mountain man did not answer, not with words, but with the steadiness of his presence. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the crowd, his jaw set, his silence louder than a shout. The widow clutched her child close, heart hammering. She had lived through shame, through hunger, through whispers, but never had she felt the weight of an entire town pressing down like this. Every man and woman in the square seemed frozen between two choices: cling to the old ways of pride or step into something different, something uncertain, but maybe kinder. The boy's small fingers curled tight around hers, and she knew his young heart was learning what it meant to watch grown men decide his future. The farmhand, pale but determined, finally stepped forward. His voice cracked but carried as he said the words that no one else had dared. "We are not wolves." The crowd stirred, uneasy, shifting their feet. He spoke again, stronger this time, reminding them of the harsh winters past, of neighbors. Helping neighbors, of families that had only survived because someone had shared a sack of flour or a bundle of wood. "If we keep punishing the weak," he said, "then what are we becoming? What kind of people are we when a child has to starve in the middle of our own homes?" His words cut through the cold air, slicing into the silence that had bound them. All. For a long moment, no one moved. The baker sneered, raising his hand as though to strike the young man, but before he could take a step, the mountain man shifted. It wasn't a threat, not exactly just a small, deliberate movement forward, enough to remind everyone that he would not let violence fall unanswered. The baker froze, his face dark with rage but his courage faltering in the face of that quiet defiance. The preacher, who had stood at the edge wringing his hands, finally found his voice. It was not a thunderous sermon this time, not lofty words meant to soothe. Instead, it was low, raw, almost pleading. He admitted his failure, confessed that he had let fear silence him when he should have spoken truth. His voice trembled as he declared that mercy was not weakness, and that cruelty would only eat the town alive from within. The words seemed to break something open. For the first time, people lowered their torches. The widow felt her knees weaken as relief swept over her. She pulled her child close and pressed her face into his hair, whispering thanks she did not even know how to shape. Around her, neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, torn between shame and hope. The baker's fury boiled, but his followers were faltering, their eyes darting, their grips loosening on their torches. The spell of fear was breaking. The mountain man finally spoke then, his voice deep and steady, carrying in the stillness of the square. "The land is hard enough," he said. "Why make it harder?" His words were simple, but they rang true, echoing against the walls of every heart present. He turned his gaze on the baker and added, "Bread was made to be eaten, not guarded." Like gold. The baker's face twisted, pride fighting against the crumbling wall around him. But the crowd was no longer with him. He spat into the snow, threw his torch down, and stalked away into the night, his men following, their anger smoldering but their confidence shattered. The square, once so charged with rage, seemed suddenly lighter, as though the snow itself had lifted. In the days that followed, the village began to change. Not quickly, not without struggle, but in small, steady steps. The widow no longer found only cold stares when she walked to the well. A neighbor offered her firewood openly, another gave her a small sack of meal. Her child was invited to play again, though not everyone welcomed him with ease. Suspicion lingered, but compassion had broken its way back into the town, and it could not be shoved aside so easily now. The farmhand gained quiet respect. He did not seek it, but people began to look to him as one who had spoken truth when no one else dared. He still worked his fields, still carried himself shyly, but when disputes rose in the tavern, men listened when he spoke. His courage had planted something new in the soil of the town. The preacher, humbled by his own failings, preached less of fire and more of forgiveness. He visited homes more often, listening instead of speaking, learning to lead not by authority but by presence. Though some still doubted him, others saw a man trying to make amends, and in that they found a little faith restored. The mountain man returned to his cabin, as he had always preferred, but he was no longer just the stranger in the hills. Children whispered about him as though he were a figure out of legend, and some men nodded to him in the square when he passed. He did not linger, did not seek thanks, but when he traded his furs for flour or salt, he was met with quiet respect. The widow's child still visited him, carrying small sticks of wood or listening to tales by the fire. Their bond remained not of need anymore, but of trust. The baker, though, never softened. His pride was a wound that did not heal, and though he continued his trade, his laughter never rang out in the tavern again. People still bought his bread, but they did so with less eagerness, as though every loaf carried the taste of bitterness. Over time, he grew quieter, his shadow shrinking in the square where once it had loomed so large. The winter passed, harsh but bearable, for the town found itself slowly working together again. Families shared what little they had, not always freely, but more willingly than before. The widow and her child survived not through pity alone, but through the slow, stubborn return of community. And when spring came, green pushing through the last patches of snow, it felt to many as though something within the village had thawed as well. The boy grew stronger that year, taller and brighter-eyed. He carried with him the memory of hunger, but also the memory of kindness, of the night when his town stood on the edge of cruelty and chose a different way. He asked his mother once why the mountain man had risked so much for them. She smiled, brushing his hair from his face, and said, "Sometimes one person's courage is enough to remind others who they are." And so the story settled into memory, retold in whispers by firelight, remembered each time bread was broken on a table. The lesson lingered not in grand speeches or declarations, but in the quiet acts that shape daily life. Neighbors looked at one another differently, aware of how close they had come to losing more than they realized. The mountain still loomed over the valley, silent and unchanging, but in the hearts of the people something had shifted. Pride had been tested, cruelty exposed, and though scars remained, compassion had taken root again. The town would never forget the night when torches flared, when silence nearly gave way to violence, and when a single loaf of bread changed everything. In the end, the widow no longer begged, the child no longer went hungry, and the people no longer hid entirely behind the walls of their fear. Life remained hard, the winter still cruel, but they faced it differently now. They faced it knowing that survival meant more than strength alone. It meant kindness, shared burdens, and the courage to stand when standing was hardest. And though years would pass, and children would grow into adults who only knew the story as something told by their elders, the lesson held. A mountain man's quiet defiance, a widow's desperate need, a child's hunger, and a town's reckoning all became part of their history. A reminder carved deeper than snow or stone. So the tale closed not with thunder, but with the steady truth of life in the valley. that even in the harshest times, humanity could endure, and that sometimes the smallest act, one loaf of bread, freely given, could be enough to change the course of an entire town.